Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping right into the sweltering, anxious heat of July 1936. We're going to experience the chaotic, deeply uncertain, and honestly explosive outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. We're not treating this as just a dry sequence of dates and facts. No, we're looking at this as a living, breathing world, a moment where the outcomes were entirely unknown, risks were absolutely fatal, and a nation was about to completely fracture.
It is incredibly tempting to look back and think, well, a conflict like this was just destined to happen, right? But let's challenge that myth of inevitability right off the bat. This tragedy wasn't preordained. It was the result of a really complex, tragic collision between individual choices, profound economic desperation, and a total collapse of political institutions. To understand how a society literally breaks in two, we have to zoom in on the exact moments and underlying forces that pushed it right over the edge.
It all comes to a head over an incredibly tight 48-hour timeline, where the last illusions of order were shattered on the dark streets of Madrid. On July 12th, Lieutenant José Castillo, who was a socialist assault guard, was gunned down by right-wing phalangists. And then, the very next night, in a direct, completely illegal reprisal, government-aligned security forces abducted José Calvo Sotelo, a really prominent right-wing opposition leader, right from his home. He was shot in the back of the neck in a police vehicle. This tit-for-tat assassination of a high-profile politician by state forces, that was the definitive catalyst. For the military plotters who had been kinda hesitating in the shadows, the crack of that pistol signaled that constitutional government was officially dead.
Section 1. The Powder Keg. Spain's Economic Divide.
So, how exactly does a local, albeit shocking, murder ignite an entire nationwide war? Well, we've got to pivot from individual trauma to the deep, structural forces that served as the powder keg for this explosion. Look at this stark, almost feudal contrast in the agricultural system. Down in the sun-baked southern regions of Andalusia and Extremadura, the economy was defined by latifundia. These were massive estates owned by a tiny fraction of wealthy, often absentee aristocratic landowners. Pitted directly against them were the braceros, millions of landless day laborers enduring crippling seasonal unemployment, illiteracy, and literal starvation wages. This wasn't just everyday inequality, this was centuries of ingrained, simmering class hatred just waiting for a match.
12,000. That incredibly low number is the total amount of families successfully resettled by the Republic's highly anticipated 1932 agrarian reform law. Out of an estimated 2 million desperate landless laborers, only 12,000 actually received land by early 1934. The law was super complex, chronically underfunded, and hopelessly slow. And you can imagine this profound disappointment deeply radicalized the rural poor. Stripped of their hope in the democratic process, they were driven straight into the arms of radical anarchist and socialist unions who were demanding the immediate, forceful seizure of land.
Simultaneously, we really have to look at the psychological terror gripping the other side of that economic divide. The urban middle classes, the industrialists, and devout Catholics were watching their country paralyze under constant labor strikes, violent land occupations, and terrifying church burnings. Driven by a very real existential fear of an impending Bolshevik-style revolution that would strip their property and threaten their lives, a lot of folks within the middle class and business elites began quietly funding right-wing paramilitaries. They were eagerly looking toward military generals to step in and restore order, basically by any means necessary.
Section 2. The Fractured Republic. Politics on the Brink. These intense, life-or-death economic anxieties spilled right into the political arena during the incredibly tense general elections of February 1936. Spaniards felt they were voting for the very survival of their way of life. And notice the fatal structural flaw in these results. The left-wing Popular Front coalition won exactly 263 legislative seats, while the right-wing alliances secured 132. But the popular vote on the ground? It was practically a dead heat. It was separated by a razor-thin margin of roughly 150,000 votes out of nearly 10 million cast. Spain's majoritarian electoral system completely warped that narrow popular divide into massive legislative dominance for the left. As historian Stanley G. Payne points out, documented instances of ballot tampering, intimidation by leftist militias, and falsified protocols in several provinces severely eroded institutional trust. For the conservative half of the country, this perceived imbalance was the breaking point. To them, it didn't look like a democratic mandate at all. It looked like an illegal, revolutionary seizure of power. The center just could no longer hold.
Section 3. The uprising begins. A nation splinters.
So, getting back to the assassination of Calvo Sotelo, That gave generals like Emilio Mola, who was the chief architect of the plot, and Francisco Franco the final justification they needed to abandon the Constitution, step out of the shadows, and launch their coup. The military conspirators originally intended a swift, surgical takeover of the country within 48 hours. But as we know, history rarely follows a script. The military realities on the ground were utterly chaotic. The uprising was forced to ignite prematurely in Spanish Morocco on July 17th after the plot was discovered. It then spread to the mainland on the 18th. By the 19th, instead of peaceful surrenders, fierce, bloody street battles were erupting in the largest cities. And just to add to the sheer disarray, on July 20th, the nominal leader of the rebellion, General Sanjurjo, actually died in a plane crash. This left a massive power vacuum that Francisco Franco would eventually step in to fill.
Ultimately, the initial coup was a partial failure, leaving the nation sliced violently in two. The rebels, who were now calling themselves Nationalists, successfully consolidated power in the conservative, highly Catholic rural strongholds of the north and parts of the south. But the Republic fiercely held on to the vital industrial hubs, the gold reserves, and the major population centers, places like Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia.
Section 4. Citizens against soldiers. The Republic arms the workers.
So why exactly did the general's master plan fail so spectacularly in those cities? Well, the crucial variable, the one the military fatally underestimated, was an unprecedented, desperate, and terrifying response from the Republican government itself. In what was a truly cinematic clash, Prime Minister José Jurel made a fateful decision. He bypassed the regular army, which he obviously could no longer trust, and authorized the distribution of over 250,000 rifles directly to the socialist and anarchist trade unions. Just imagine the scene in Madrid and Barcelona. Tens of thousands of everyday citizens, factory workers and unionists, newly armed, throwing up cobblestone barricades and laying siege to military barracks. Driven by intense revolutionary fervor, they overwhelmed disciplined, professional military troops with sheer numbers and raw desperation.
But the horrific reality of what followed spared absolutely no one. Both zones immediately descended into systemic terror driven by mutual existential fear. In the nationalist zone, martial law was declared, which resulted in the brutal, organized military purging of unionists, leftists, and honestly anyone even suspected of Republican sympathies, to enforce a rigid, absolute order. Meanwhile, in the Republican zone, arming the unions led to the immediate collapse of state authority. This sparked radical, revolutionary experimentation, the collectivization of factories, and horrifying, unchecked mob violence against conservatives, business owners, and the Catholic clergy. It was a complete societal breakdown, where neighbor turned violently against neighbor.
Section 5. The world chooses sides. A global proxy war. As the Spanish nation bled internally, we have to look outward, because this domestic fracture immediately transformed into a geopolitical testing ground. The Spanish Civil War quickly became a bloody proxy war for the mounting ideological tensions of 1930s Europe. A fatal imbalance of global intervention basically decided the early fate of the conflict. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini eagerly bypassed international law, dispatching bombers, troops, and transport planes to aid Franco. Portugal stepped in and offered crucial logistical supply lines. On the other side, the Soviet Union's aid to the Republic was initially delayed and highly conditional. And tragically for the Republic, Western democracies like France and the UK chose appeasement. Terrified of sparking World War II, they hid behind an official policy of non-intervention, which effectively cut the legal Spanish government off from international arms markets. 15,000. Think about that number for a second. When the Spanish Navy largely remained loyal to the Republic and blockaded the Strait of Gibraltar, Franco's elite army of Africa was trapped in Morocco. The coup was literally on the verge of suffocating right there in its cradle. But Hitler answered the call, dispatching German Junkers Ju-52s to Morocco. In what was the world's first major military airlift, 15,000 heavily armed nationalist troops were flown directly over the blockade and into Seville. This massive, unprecedented fascist intervention totally saved Franco's stranded forces, fundamentally shifted the balance of power, and, you could strongly argue, sealed Spain's fate. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left to ponder a really heavy question. When the systems of a nation completely collapse and neighbor turns against neighbor, what is the ultimate human cost? We've seen how decades of economic disparity, institutional failure, extreme polarization, and foreign opportunism collided in the summer of 1936. A society broke completely in two, setting the tragic stage for a grueling, bloody 3-year war that would result in hundreds of thousands of deaths and radically reshape the modern world. It is a stark, chilling reminder of just how fragile democratic systems can be when fear replaces trust.
Thank you for joining me to explore the profound anatomy of this historical rupture. Keep questioning the forces that shape our world, and I'll catch you in the next one.